People who have accidentally caused the death of another person. What happened? Story 1. When I was 16, I made a fatal mistake. After running a stop sign, I hit an elderly gentleman of 87 years old. I stayed by his side and held his hand, but sadly, he suffered a heart attack and passed away on the sidewalk. It was unclear if the heart attack occurred before or after the accident, but his family responded with great kindness and understanding. His son even phoned me the day after it happened to tell me that his mother had sadly passed away 6 months prior and his father had become very depressed. They were saddened by the way his life ended, yet comforted by the thought of their parents being reunited in heaven. I'm grateful to his family for their grace and compassion. Story 2. I was dating a woman who had been affected by a deeply traumatic experience. The sexual abuse she had suffered at the hands of her grandfather. When I noticed her exhibiting signs of distress, she eventually opened up to me about what happened. Once we had ended our relationship, I told her mother that it would be best if Grandpa no longer attended family Thanksgiving dinners owing to the abuse he had inflicted on her. Her mother accused me of lying, but after questioning her other daughters and cousins, it was confirmed that they too had been molested. When Grandma found out, she simply said, "I'll take care of it." In less than a week, Grandpa was dead. It was believed that Grandma had tampered with his medications, causing his death, which was eventually ruled a natural cause. Despite this, no action was taken against Grandma. Story 3. I had been eagerly anticipating meeting my friend who was supposed to join me for soccer practice. Yet, when I arrived at the rendezvous spot, he was nowhere to be seen. Growing impatient, I chose to go on ahead without him. It was only 2 days later that I found out what had happened to my friend. My mom informed me that he had been struck by a car after he had darted out into the street to retrieve a ball he had been kicking while waiting for me. It was painfully obvious that if I had just taken a minute longer, he wouldn't have to wait and would still be alive. Story 4. When I was 18, I had the difficult job of working the night shift as an aide in a nursing home. One of my responsibilities was to turn the paralyzed patients every 2 hours to avoid bed sores. One of my patients had late-stage Parkinson's disease, which made her muscles and joints very stiff and brittle. On one occasion, as I was flipping her from one side to another, I unknowingly applied too much pressure to her leg, causing her femur to snap. Because of her age and health, the doctors deemed surgery too risky and had to let her heal on her own, if at all. Unfortunately, due to her inability to be flipped, she developed bed sores, which eventually led to septic shock and her death. I've always felt so guilty about this. Story 5. For years, my family has been spending part of the year in the U.S. and the other part in Thailand. During one of these trips when I was 8, my family and my cousin's family were at the beach in Siam. My cousin's son, James, and I had been splashing in the waves for hours and were both exhausted. Suddenly, a thunderstorm approached and the water grew more turbulent with large waves. As soon as my parents heard thunder, they called for us to come back to the shore. I rushed back without waiting to see if James was with me. When I reached the sand, I looked back, but he was nowhere to be seen. We had gone much further out than 2 8-year-olds should have, and his exhaustion had left him unable to keep his head above the water. I still can't help but think about what might have happened if I had stayed to make sure James was with me. Every time I go back to the condo there, I can't bring myself to step back into the ocean. Story 6. My sister and I had a day of fun together until it was time to collect her from work. Knowing her husband had been drinking, I drove to the dealership to pick her up instead. When I returned home with her, we found that he had gone for a walk to cool off. Unfortunately, the next morning, the state police were at our door informing us of the tragic news that my sister's husband had been struck and killed by a train while he was asleep on the tracks. Story 7. I was skiing with a friend in Colorado and we were going at a good speed, enjoying the mountain. When we got back onto the main trail, he kept going at a rapid pace, so I shouted for him to slow down. At the same time, an elderly lady merged onto the trail, and my buddy, who was a big guy, collided with her. The ski patrol took her off the mountain, and she was in a lot of pain. Unfortunately, she died from her injuries a few days later. The authorities concluded that both of them were at fault, so my friend had to pay fines but was not sued. Story 8. I was absorbed in my gaming session when my best friend messaged me asking if I had time to talk. I assumed he wanted to chat about something trivial, so I decided to message him back when I was finished playing. Hours passed before I finally replied, but he didn't respond, which was strange, but I thought he was probably just busy. Sadly, he never replied again. The next day at school, I was shattered to hear about the news that he had taken his own life at the same time I was gaming. I still feel immense guilt, knowing that if only I had replied to him right away, I could have possibly talked him out of it. I now make a conscious effort to never leave a friend stranded again, although I wish I had thought of that sooner. Story 9. That night, I was 19 and she was 19. We had planned to go out and then head to the lake the next day. I'd just moved back from Tacoma, Washington, and was exhausted from the long drive, so I decided to stay home. She agreed to go to the small party and come pick me up in the morning. Then the unthinkable happened. Early in the morning, one of our friends called screaming. She had been involved in a fatal accident just half a mile from home on the way back from the party. I can't help but think that if we had stuck to the plan, I could have been there and maybe prevented the tragedy. I will never forgive myself for not being there. It's been over 20 years, yet the pain still lingers. I still have nightmares about what happened, and I struggle to cope with the guilt, all because I was simply too tired to go out that night. Story 10. As I was younger, playing Xbox at my grandparents' house, I left the room to go to the bathroom, leaving my wired controller on the floor. I suddenly heard a thud, but decided to finish my business before investigating the source. When I returned, I heard my grandmother's screams. She told me to stay in the bathroom, so I did. It turned out that my grandfather had stepped on the controller's wire and had fallen, hitting his head on the table and cracking his skull open. When the ambulance arrived, he was pronounced dead. Since then, I've been extra careful about where I leave items, and I make sure that my younger siblings clean up after themselves when they're done playing. Story 11. As a child, I recall having a fit of rage in the mall with my mom and grandma. I can no longer recall why I was so upset, but I ended up running away. Tragically, my grandma took a fall down a flight of stairs, and my mom, who had difficulty communicating in English, struggled to find me and get her mom to the hospital. Sadly, my grandma passed away due to the injury. Story 12. In my mid-20s, when I got my girlfriend pregnant, she was desperate for me not to tell my family. She was scared that they'd tell her mom, and she'd be kicked out of the house. Consequently, when she visited, she would barely eat and wear baggy clothes to hide the pregnancy. After about 6-7 months, her mother found out and surprisingly wasn't mad. Instead, she was enthusiastic and ready to start a family. Unfortunately, during the pregnancy, my girlfriend became ill with a kidney infection due to malnutrition. She had neglected to take any prenatal vitamins and barely ate for 9 months. As a result, when the baby was born, it weighed less than 2 pounds and had numerous health complications. Sadly, the child only lived for 4 months. Story 13. When I was 7, I went on a stroll with my beloved grandmother to the park. Before we headed back home, I asked my grandmother if she'd buy me an ice cream. She happily obliged, and we started walking back. Suddenly, I suggested we take a scenic route through the park instead of around it. She sweetly accepted my idea, and we began our stroll. Unfortunately, we were the victims of a hit and run. My grandmother was severely injured, but she held on for a while. Sadly, she succumbed to her injuries and passed away. Story 14. At 17 years old, I had just left school when the rain stopped. As I was slowing down to a stop behind a bus at a red light, the light turned green and the bus still wasn't moving. Knowing I had to get through the intersection, I moved to the left lane. However, the bus then stopped to let some pedestrians who had a red light cross the crosswalk. By the time they had crossed, it was too late for me to react. I hit the brakes and frantically turned my wheel, causing my truck to spin around and hit something. I eventually came to a stop across the street, praying it was the bus I had hit. Unfortunately, I had hit a 16-year-old fellow student. She was airlifted to Seattle, but sadly passed away 4 hours later.